Because this one team that represented the region as a whole internationally ended up losing in a 5th game to RNG, people decided, okay, well, that's it. LPL is the best region. And that was a really dangerous precedent to set because... Hello, everyone, and welcome to WCG Close-up. This will be the 12th episode, so this is episode 12. My name is Wolf, and you guys know me for a lot of esports reasons, no doubt. Today I want to talk about a topic that is... I think a lot of people incorrectly identify that the best region for a particular esport is the region that is held by the International Tournament's champion. If after Damwon Kia won Worlds, the assumption was by a lot of people that Korea was then by default the strongest region. And I personally disagree. I don't think that was true just because Damwon ended up winning the finals. So let's talk about historical dominance that we've seen in a lot of esports. I'm going to talk about esports that I've worked on and I'm very attached to. So let's talk about Starcraft first. Starcraft is arguably the most Korean-dominated game, and the only esport that has ever really been dominated by one region throughout its lifetime, completely. Like, unquestionably, Korea was the strongest region, is the strongest region, and it seems like throughout the rest of StarCraft's competitive life, both StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2, that's not going to change. We know Korea is the strongest region in StarCraft, and that was verified every year by a multitude of tournaments. In StarCraft Brood War, the first real big international event was WCG, in fact. And no non-Korean ever won WCG. Ever. In fact, no non-Korean player ever took a game off of a Korean player in a grand finals in WCG history. BlizzCon was so Korean-dominated that they had to change the format. In 2015, there were 15 Koreans and then Lilbo. And Lilbo got 3-0'd. And then there was only Koreans left in the bracket. They changed the format for BlizzCon so that more foreign players would actually play. They added some more region locking. So it was more difficult for Koreans to then just leave Korea and then participate in European leagues or American leagues. Until 2018, Koreans still won every time. So when Serral won in 2018, it was a very historic moment because no non-Korean player had ever won a StarCraft 2 or StarCraft 1 BlizzCon title before. It had never happened, and Serral was the first one in 2018. It did not mean that Europe was now the most dominant StarCraft region in the world. It meant that Serral was the best individual StarCraft player, and there were only 2 non-Koreans in the top 8 at that BlizzCon, if I remember correctly. So very much a Korean-dominated game. It was another game that I commentated called Heroes of the Storm. They were big international events, right? And they were usually dominated by Korean teams. The teams that dominated were MVP Black, which later became Gen G, L5, which later became Ballistics, and of course a team called Tempest. And those were the 3 teams that would dominate international events. There were a lot of Korea versus Korea finals in Heroes of the Storm. But in 2017, at the Mid-Season Brawl, which is kind of like Heroes of the Storm's MSI, the Heroes of the Storm esports format was almost exactly the same as League of Legends, so you can draw a very strong comparison between the two. In 2017, it was a Europe versus Europe finals, Dignitas versus Fnatic, and at that moment in time, at that year, there had been a lot of talk about Korea getting weaker. Some of the rosters hadn't really changed. There wasn't a lot of growth. Viewership was not very high in Korea. And there was a lot of discussion like, I think Europe might win this time. And then not only did Europe win, but it was a Europe versus Europe finals. And in terms of scrims that everyone was watching during that time, and even the group stage, it was very clear Korea was not the most dominant region. And you did end up getting that Europe versus Europe finals. In cases like that, you actually have so much data. You can see the Korean teams are not performing well in groups. You can see they're falling apart. You can see them lose in that final bracket. And then you can watch the European teams play at finals and go, okay, the level of play here is higher at that moment. Now, at that time, Europe was actually the strongest Heroes of the Storm region. And it was actually a very competitive region to get Dignitas and Fnatic as the representatives from Europe as well in the European HGC. So that's one example of a time where there was a big shift in terms of domination. Now, after Korea lost in that tournament at the midseason brawl, they trained a lot, and then we went to BlizzCon. Korea ended up winning BlizzCon again, and the subsequent one as well. They weren't as dominant as they were before, and you could still make an argument that HGC Korea and HGC Europe were very close in terms of their ability to play, and it was hard to definitively say at the very end of the last BlizzCon finals, with Gen G there, that Korea was the best Heroes of the Storm region, but results and historical precedents kind of led people to believe that. But I think it's important to draw distinctions between this team won a title, so therefore the region is the best, and this team's region, how they perform consistently through groups, how they're doing in the bracket, how they look with the eye test. The eye test is a term we use in esports to say, okay, stats can tell you one thing, but what you see with your eyes, you can actually tell there's something different going on, right? That's kind of the eye test as a term. Oh, League of Legends history is a lot more complicated, right? Because there were a lot of Korea versus Korea finals over the years. We did have Fnatic win the first tournament that didn't have any Korean teams. Then Taipei Assassins won the second one. But Taipei Assassins came in through a regional qualifier. They were doing extremely well at that time. If you go back and look at the history of that era, every team was saying they're the strongest team in scrims. Like, there were warning signs that this team was just like this crazy outlier. Then Koreans continued to dominate until we get to 2018, which is where you had the Invictus Fnatic finals. And there were actually no Koreans in top 4. Didn't even get to Chinese teams actually going to the finals. At that time, it wasn't really definitive that Europe was the best region or China was the best region, even though G2 was in there. They beat RNG. Then Invictus beat them, right, to go to the finals. So in that moment in 2018, the one thing that we all knew, and the one thing that was really scary for us in Seoul was, right now Korea is not the best region. But there were a lot of people who said, well, that means the EU LCS is the best region and the only region you should care about because we got 2 teams in the top 4. And there were others who said, oh, no, China is the strongest. Look at Invictus. Like, RNG just barely lost to G2. So there was a lot of discussion at that time about which was the best. And everyone was always raising their hand like, my region is the best. My region is the best. And this always happens, right? But in my opinion, and I think in most reasonable-minded people's opinion, the one thing we learned, right, from that tournament in 2018 was that Korea was not the best region anymore. And then in 2019, I always forget the G2 versus Team Liquid finals happened. Like, I have this written down in my notes because I always forget this actually occurred. But G2 ended up winning the MSI finals. FPX won Worlds that year. So it was another year of, okay, Korea's not looking so hot. China's looking a lot better. So there's always this like kind of creeping up of, is LPL the best region? We're getting closer to today, right? And FPX ends up winning 2019. And then there were a lot of Chinese favorites in 2020 that didn't end up going to the finals, right? It was actually Suning who ended up going to the finals against Damwon Kia, or rather, at the time, Damwon Gaming. And Damwon won, but the performance that we saw from Chinese teams was so good in groups, and there was a lot of talk that year because people were actually watching the LPL and realizing the region has leveled up as a whole, even with non-Korean players. With Chinese rosters, they looked really strong. People weren't ready to believe that because Damwon won Worlds, that Korea was the best region. Now, some people did say, okay, we have the best region again. Like, it's time. Let's party here in Korea. LCK is back. And then MSI happened. This is where the term one-team region comes from, is from Damwon winning Worlds, then dominating spring season, then going to MSI, where they didn't dominate as hard as RNG did in the groups. They barely beat Mad Lions, and then lost to RNG in the finals. And that was the moment where, like, everybody was like, that's it! LPL's the best. They almost won Worlds, and then they won MSI. Everybody knows LPL is stronger, and Korea only has one team because Damwon dominated Spring, and they're the same team who ended up doing well in both, of those international events. And nobody watched nobody was talking about the finals either, but that was also a dominant win for Damwon. And so, because this one team that represented the region as a whole internationally ended up losing in a 5th game to RNG, people decided, okay, well, that's it. LPL is the best region. And that was a really dangerous precedent to set, because when you just take one championship, remember, LPL did not win Worlds, and their performance in groups was a little bit lackluster compared to what people's expectations were. And again, it was Suning who ended up going as kind of an underdog pick through to the finals, which that in itself should have been like a little bit of a warning sign that the LPL teams weren't as stable as people thought. Then comes MSI, which RNG wins, and everybody, I think, overreacted to that Game 5 win. Didn't watch LPL that much, most people, most average fans. I mean, you could look at the English viewership, it's not as high as some of the other regions, it's not as high as the LCK. And suddenly, out of nowhere, FPX doesn't make it out of groups. EDG doesn't get first in groups. And then RNG has to play a tiebreaker for Hanwha for first place. Hanwha, which was the 8th place team from Korea. And I think a lot of people thought that was a huge upset because of this notion, this idea that China was the best region. And I'm bringing this all to a whole here because I think it's really important to set the right tone as, esports broadcasters and also as fans for what strong teams are based on wider and bigger results. The reason I mentioned the domination of Koreans in Starcraft, for example, was that it was very clear. It was always known. You know what you're expecting. When Serral and Neeb, for example, took games off of top Korean pros, you thought you could see why it was a big deal because there was so much respect, and those were upsets because okay, this is so rare because Korea is the dominant region. And in League of Legends for a while, it was like that, and now we've kind of the playing field has leveled quite a bit. To create these narratives for the LPL and Chinese teams can lead to big disappointment, and it can lead to a false narrative of upsets, and it can lead to this idea of, wow, I guess LPL is bad now, or something, which isn't true either, but the expectations were too high based off of one team's performance in an international event at MSI. And of course, the narrative that was built around that by LPL fans and fans who wanted to see other regions like Korea fail. So I think it is really important to, when deciding which is the best region, look at who's in top 8, who's in top 4, how well are those teams performing in their own region before coming to the international event. Does it seem extremely competitive? RNG, for example, their run to get to MSI was extremely competitive, which was another compelling argument for why, maybe LPL was the best region, because it was really hard for them to actually make it to MSI. And then they steamrolled most of MSI. When Worlds is finished, we will know whether or not Korea is the best region in fact, or if we need more time. But I ask you, fan, watching WCG Close-up Episode 12, I ask you to not overreact. Let's wait and see the results. Take these things slowly. We've had a lot of historic dominance in the past. Let's not rush it. It might be that in League of Legends, there is no dominant region for a while. It might come back to Korea, might go to a different region, but right now, let's not stamp the Korea stamp on there just yet. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we'll see you in episode 13.